write the full long-form script based on all reference materials and your detailed instructions. Something happened over the skies of Iran that the world wasn't supposed to know about. Not immediately, not cleanly, and certainly not in the terms that would allow anyone to fully grasp what had just changed. But the evidence is now accumulating, cross-referenced against satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and the observable behavior of both sides in the days that followed. And what it points to is not a battlefield victory in the conventional sense. It points to something more durable, more calculated, and more consequential than a single strike. It points to a deliberate decision to stop repairing what had already been broken and start destroying what could not be rebuilt. To understand why that distinction matters, you have to step back from the explosion itself and ask a question that very few analysts were asking before this operation. What does Iran actually need to sustain its ability to project military power across the region, not the missiles already loaded, not the launch crews already trained? The question is upstream of all that. What does it take to keep building the next generation of ballistic weapons capable of reaching Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Eastern Mediterranean? And what happens if that capacity is interrupted not for a month or a year, but for the kind of time frame that genuinely restructures strategic options? That's the question this operation was designed to answer. From the inside of Iran's own production infrastructure, the mission launched late at night. The exact hour matters less than what the timing communicated about intent. Deep strike operations of this complexity don't begin because an opportunity opened up. They begin because months of intelligence work, satellite observation, and signals analysis have compressed into a single actionable window. The formation that crossed into Iranian airspace was not improvised. It was not reactive. It was the product of a targeting process that had been running in parallel with every public ceasefire discussion, every diplomatic statement, and every public claim that the situation was stabilizing. While negotiators talked, analysts watched. And what they watched was a rebuilding process that was moving faster than anyone in the open source community had predicted. 9 months earlier, a previous round of strikes had hit what was publicly described as Iran's solid rocket propellant mixing infrastructure. At the time, the assessment was that this constituted a serious setback, that destroying the planetary mixers used to blend fuel components would impose a recovery timeline of roughly 18 months. That estimate was not unreasonable. It was based on the genuine scarcity of specialized industrial equipment, the difficulty of sourcing replacements under sanctions, and the assumption that the combination of coalition air dominance and satellite surveillance would slow any reconstruction effort. Iran proved that assessment wrong in 5 months. Not because the intelligence community fundamentally misunderstood the target, but because planetary mixers, despite their specialized function, are ultimately commercial equipment. With the right intermediaries, the right financial channels, and a supply chain that had been stress-tested through years of sanctions evasion, Iran sourced replacement machinery before the wreckage at the original site had fully cooled. The missiles that subsequently arced toward Israeli territory during the escalation cycles that followed were propelled by fuel mixed in equipment that Israel had technically already destroyed. That fact, that it quietly confirmed and quietly absorbed, forced a fundamental reassessment of the targeting logic. Destroying replaceable components creates a delay. It does not create a permanent constraint. And permanent constraint was precisely what this next operation was engineered to achieve. The target this time was not a mixing hall. It was a casting facility. And for anyone who hasn't spent time in the world of ballistic missile production, the difference between those two things is not intuitive, but it is everything. Think of solid rocket propellant production as a two-stage industrial process. First, you mix the propellant, fuel, oxidizer, and binder combined under controlled conditions into a viscous, chemically stable compound. That's what the planetary mixers do. Second, you cast the propellant. You pour the mixed compound into a mold shaped exactly like the interior of the rocket motor casing, around a central mandrel that creates the combustion channel, and you allow it to cure under precise temperature and pressure conditions for weeks or months. The structure that houses that casting process, the pit, the infrastructure, the environmental controls, is not a machine you can source through intermediaries. It is civil engineering. It is poured concrete. It is a facility that takes years to plan, permit, finance, and construct, even under normal conditions. Under coalition air supremacy, with satellites capturing every significant ground disturbance within hours of occurrence, you cannot build a new one. There is no back-channel procurement for a concrete casting pit. This is what Israeli intelligence had identified as the real choke point, not the equipment that blends the fuel, the infrastructure that shapes it into a usable weapon. The formation approaching the target complex that night was tracking a specific thermal signature. The electro-optical targeting systems aboard the lead aircraft had been correlating data across multiple passes, multiple intelligence sources, and multiple spectral bands for weeks. A casting facility operating at full capacity radiates a distinctive heat signature, the thermal byproduct of propellant curing inside the pit. At 40 kilometers distance, the sensors had confirmed what the analysts suspected. Building 12 at the target complex was not a storage facility. It was not administrative space. It was a casting hall, actively operating, processing what thermal analysis estimated to be first-stage motor assemblies for Iran's medium-range ballistic inventory. Getting to that building, however, required crossing an air defense environment that had been systematically adapted by people who had spent the previous 9 months studying exactly how coalition aircraft operated. The first serious threat appeared approximately 90 minutes into Iranian airspace. The radar warning receiver aboard the lead aircraft flagged a short-range surface-to-air missile system, a Tor M1, a Russian-built point defense platform that Iran positions around its highest-value infrastructure. The Tor is not a long-range system. Its engagement envelope is roughly 12 kilometers, but that apparent limitation is precisely what makes it dangerous in this specific tactical context. Long-range air defense systems in western Iran had spent the better part of a week being systematically suppressed. Any radar that radiated continuously gave coalition anti-radiation missiles a signal to track and a target to kill. The Tor's operator had survived by doing what his longer-range colleagues could not, staying completely silent until the target was close enough that silence was no longer necessary. He hadn't been guessing. He had been waiting for data, and the data had arrived 3 minutes earlier through a low-frequency early warning network that doesn't provide the precision needed for a fire control solution, but provides exactly enough bearing and range information to position a point defense system in the right place at the right time. VHF radar, the low-frequency variant used for early warning, cannot guide a missile to a stealth aircraft with targeting precision. But it can tell a Tor operator, something is coming from the southwest, and it will be within your engagement zone in approximately 4 minutes. That was enough. The pilot's first response was electronic, attempting to overwhelm the Tor's fire control radar with the aircraft's jamming suite. Under other circumstances, against a radar operating on a fixed frequency, that approach can be effective. But the Tor hops frequencies between pulses at a rate that makes sustained jamming effectively impossible. By the time the jamming energy concentrates on one frequency channel, the system has already moved to the next 3, and because the Tor's terminal guidance relies on inertial tracking once the missile is airborne, it doesn't need continuous radar contact to complete the engagement. 15 seconds of degraded data is enough. The physics of the engagement, a 28G missile against an aircraft limited to 7G sustained turns, do not favor the pilot in the terminal phase. What the pilot had in his favor was timing. Specifically, the fact that a fire control lock at this range required approximately 4 seconds of continuous track before the system's computers had enough data to commit to a firing solution. Not enough to fire and be certain, enough to fire and hope. The pilot broke hard, dispensed countermeasures, and accepted the altitude loss that came with the defensive maneuver, 8,000 feet in 8 seconds of sustained high-G maneuvering, dropping from 22,000 to 14,000 feet. The lock broke. He was alive. But he was now 2,000 feet below the ceiling of the shoulder-fired missile systems positioned on the ground around the facility itself, and climbing back through that altitude band while simultaneously executing a bombing run is not a comfortable problem to solve. What followed was a weapons release calculated to the margins of what was physically possible, rolling inverted from 20,000 feet, nose toward the target, releasing the weapon in a diving profile that kept the aircraft above the man-portable missile ceiling at separation, while placing the bomb on a viable trajectory toward the reinforced roof of Building 12. The bomb bay doors opened for 8 seconds during which the aircraft's radar cross-section increased from near invisible to highly detectable. The Tor operator, still recovering from the earlier break, saw the bloom on his scope and moved to re-engage. He needed 4 seconds of continuous track. He got 3. The doors closed, the aircraft returned to its low observable profile, and the fire control solution the operator had been building collapsed into a 4-second-old coordinate set pointing at empty sky. The weapon struck Building 12's reinforced roof and detonated inside the casting hall. The blast collapsed the mandrel assembly, destroyed a motor casing in the final stages of cure, and imploded the concrete pit structure inward. 4 months of civil engineering, gone in under 5 seconds. What Iran's production managers had spent a season building to replace what had been lost 9 months earlier. The infrastructure they believed was protected precisely because no one had struck this deep before, ceased to function in the time it takes to complete a sentence. That strike was the first of several in a coordinated sequence that walked through the facility's interconnected infrastructure. Mixing halls followed, storage buildings followed. Research and development infrastructure for cruise motor systems followed. The explosive compound storage, positioned 40 meters from the casting buildings and packed with military-grade explosive material used in warhead assembly, was struck last in a sequencing decision that reflected careful prioritization. Don't detonate the most dangerous element until the rest of the facility has already been processed. But the mission was not over, and what happened next revealed something about the strategic situation that the official strike assessments do not fully communicate. A second element of the strike package, the aircraft carrying follow-on ordnance for a deeper target, encountered a problem that had not appeared in the mission planning package. When their electro-optical systems resolved the second facility at engagement range, what they saw did not match the intelligence template they had been given. The satellite imagery that had been used to build the targeting package showed 8 structures consistent with casting and processing infrastructure. The real-time sensor picture showed something closer to a dozen. New buildings behind new blast walls, thermal signatures indicating active curing operations across structures that had not existed or had not been detectable when the planning imagery was collected. Iran had not merely rebuilt what was damaged in the previous strike cycle, it had expanded. The facility had grown laterally, adding capacity in parallel with the recovery operation, using construction methods and materials that were either invisible to the satellite passes that informed the targeting package or had been added in the interval between the last imagery collection and the mission's execution. The result was a targeting deficit, more active infrastructure than the weapons load could address in a single pass. The targeting decision made in the next 240 seconds defined what this operation would ultimately accomplish and what it would leave unfinished. Faced with more targets than munitions, the weapons officers made a triage call grounded in exactly the logic that had made this operation necessary in the first place. Prioritize what cannot be replaced. Every weapon was steered toward buildings showing active curing temperature signatures. The mixing infrastructure, replaceable as Iran had already demonstrated, was deliberately left for another time. What could be rebuilt in 5 months was left standing. What could not be rebuilt under air supremacy was struck first, struck precisely, and struck permanently. The remaining aircraft in the formation pressed through an air defense environment that was simultaneously adapting to the mission in real time. A mobile early warning system operating in brief 3-second bursts before relocating to prevent targeting by anti-radiation missiles had acquired the strike formation on its first pulse. 3 seconds of radar energy is not enough for a missile to lock and fire, but it is enough to produce a track-quality snapshot, a data point showing bearing, range, and general formation strength that can be transmitted to fighter aircraft already airborne and vectoring toward the same area. That snapshot had gone to a MiG-29 operating out of an eastern Iranian air base, piloted by one of a shrinking number of trained Iranian fighter pilots who had survived the attrition of the previous week's combat operations. He was flying without radar emission, deliberate discipline born from 5 days of watching every Iranian pilot who radiated get killed within minutes. His infrared search and track system swept the western sky looking for engine heat, waiting for one of the coalition aircraft to do something that generated a thermal signature large enough to track, open a weapons bay, descend to a lower altitude, engage afterburner. Any of those actions would have given him a vector for the short-range infrared missiles on his rails. He never got it. The formation led, watching the MiG's thermal signature on the distributed aperture system, made a decision that prioritized collective mission success over the tactical satisfaction of engaging a single threat. Closing to engagement range against the MiG required pulling one aircraft away from the mission formation, opening a sensor gap in the coverage architecture that was protecting the rest of the element from the mobile radar system that already knew where they were. One radar pulse from that system, timed to the moment the formation's coverage had a gap, could have given every surface-to-air battery in the corridor a fire-quality track on aircraft that had maintained their stealth advantage for the entire mission. The math didn't support the engagement. The formation maintained its discipline, presented minimal thermal signature from the frontal aspect, and allowed the MiG's infrared sensor to sweep an empty sky 4 times before the Iranian pilot, lacking anything to vector toward, was recalled to base. What the satellites found 48 hours after the mission was completed altered the analytical picture significantly. The imagery showed near total structural collapse across the casting infrastructure at the primary target. Facilities that had taken months of engineering work to build and that constituted the productive bottleneck in Iran's solid fuel motor assembly process were reduced to crater fields. The assessment that emerged was not simply that Iran had suffered another setback, it was that Iran's ability to manufacture the first-stage motors for its medium-range ballistic inventory had been interrupted at the one point in the production chain that cannot be accelerated through procurement, sanctions evasion, or industrial improvisation. This is not a temporary degradation, it is a structural one. And the difference between those two categories is not semantic. Temporary degradation can be planned around. Adversaries operating under temporary constraints simply build inventory ahead of the constraint, stockpile finished product before the capacity is lost, and draw down reserves while the rebuild proceeds. Structural degradation is different. It means that the weapons already deployed represent a finite and non-replenishing resource. Every missile fired is a missile that cannot be replaced on any timeline that strategic planners can currently calculate with confidence. The production line that was sustaining the pace of the campaign, that was allowing Iran's leadership to authorize strikes against Israeli territory with the confidence that the magazines would refill, no longer exists in a form that can deliver replacement capacity. This shifts the strategic calculus in ways that are only beginning to manifest in observable behavior. Iranian leadership has been, in the days following this operation, noticeably more circumspect in its public statements about retaliatory capacity. Proxy network activity, and which had been escalating in tempo through the preceding weeks, has shown what analysts cautiously describe as a reduced operational tempo, though whether that reflects strategic restraint or a degraded supply of the materials needed to sustain operations remains an open question. The answer to that question will emerge over the coming weeks through patterns that are not yet fully visible. What is visible is the logic that drove the targeting decision, and that logic represents a fundamental evolution in how this conflict is being prosecuted by at least one side. The previous approach, targeting what was visibly important, destroying what appeared operationally significant, accepting that sophisticated adversaries will rebuild what they can, has been replaced by something more methodical. The question being asked now is not, what does this target do? The question is, what happens if this target cannot be rebuilt? If the answer is that the adversary's long-term capacity is structurally constrained rather than temporarily degraded, the target goes to the top of the list. If the answer is that the adversary can replace it within a time frame that doesn't change the strategic balance, the target is deprioritized in favor of what cannot be replaced. That is a different kind of campaign logic, and it carries implications that extend beyond this specific operation. The pilots who flew this mission operated at the edge of what their technology, their training, and their fuel margins allowed. The electronic warfare environment they navigated was not static. It was actively adapting, using every pulse of radar energy Iran's ground forces could risk to gather data that could be passed to mobile systems and airborne interceptors. The mission succeeded not because the technology was perfect. The Bombay moment, 8 seconds of detectable radar cross-section over an active hostile air defense environment, came within 1 second of being a catastrophic tactical failure, but because the mission architecture was designed to succeed even when individual elements of the plan encountered conditions they weren't designed for. The targeting package being wrong about the number of buildings didn't cause the mission to abort. It caused the weapons officers to make triage decisions under time pressure that preserved the mission's core objective, while accepting that secondary targets would survive. That adaptability under pressure, in a contested environment against a sophisticated and actively adapting defense, is the operational detail that doesn't appear in the strike assessments, but matters enormously for understanding what this campaign is and what it is capable of sustaining. What changed on the night of this mission is not simply that a facility was destroyed. What changed is that Iran's leadership now has to make decisions about how to employ a finite, non-replenishing stock of ballistic weapons against a targeting framework that has demonstrated the ability to identify and reach the most protected elements of their production infrastructure. Every weapon fired is a weapon the production system can no longer replace on the timelines that allowed this campaign to continue. Every strike authorized is a strike that draws down an inventory that satellite imagery, now carefully watching every square meter of potential reconstruction activity, will not allow to be rebuilt under current conditions. The signals to watch in the coming weeks are specific. Watch the frequency and scale of ballistic strikes from Iranian territory. Watch whether proxy-operated launch activity maintains its recent tempo or begins to compress. Watch whether Iranian diplomatic communications, which have consistently referenced retaliatory capacity as a negotiating asset, begin to shift in tone toward a framing that emphasizes political grievance over military threat, because that shift would suggest that the military threat is being privately acknowledged as constrained. Watch whether there are any signs of reconstruction activity at the affected sites that would indicate a different approach, dispersal, concealment, underground construction, being attempted against an adversary that is now actively looking for exactly those signatures. The operation accomplished what it set out to accomplish, but the more consequential question is what it started. A campaign built on the logic of targeting what cannot be rebuilt does not reach a natural endpoint with a single successful mission. It continues for as long as there are elements of the adversary's infrastructure that meet that criterion, and as long as the operational capability to reach them remains intact. Both conditions currently appear to be met. That is why this story is not over. It has entered a phase where the outcomes are less visible, the timelines are longer, and the strategic significance of individual events is harder to assess in real time. But the underlying logic is clear, and it is compressing Iran's options in ways that will eventually force a decision that cannot be deferred indefinitely. The mission that no one was supposed to fully understand has already changed the shape of what comes next. The question now is not whether that change happened. The question is how long it takes for the consequences to become impossible to ignore. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.